what we found is that the impact of narcissistic leaders is delayed. So we actually looked at the early days for narcissists, and in fact, people were all together with them. And in fact, the top team was very connected to the CEO, who was a narcissist. But over time, what we found is that a lot of things separated. And one of the most sort of distinct representations of that was we tracked CEO and top team compensation over time. And what we found with narcissists was that the CEO's compensation separated from the top team's compensation over time to get much higher. The CEOs took more credit for success, whereas for non-narcissistic CEOs, it went actually in the opposite direction. The CEO and the top team's compensation actually came together and was more similar. So CEOs think of themselves as being the one that should be attributed with the success and the one who has sort of made things happen.
Transformational leaders challenge the status quo, provide a vision of a promising future, and motivate and inspire their followers to join in the pursuit of a better world. But many of these leaders also fit the American Psychiatric Association classification for narcissist personality disorder. They are grandiose, entitled, self-confident, risk-seeking, manipulative, and hostile. Today's episode is based on a highly cited article that reviews the literature on narcissism and shows how what we think of as transformational leadership overlaps substantially with grandiose narcissism. This episode is specifically positioned after that two-part episode we just had with Geoffrey Cain on Steve Jobs in exile. Because, as you know, Jobs was a narcissist. It is a pleasure to welcome the author of Transformational Leader, or Narcissist, How Grandiose Narcissists Can Create and Destroy Organizations and Institutions. Jennifer Chatman, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here.
It's so great to have you. First things first, your team were straight on to me. They're like, she's just written a book. And I was like, no, not another book on the list. So let's share that, because your work on Narcissist is actually interwoven into this new book on organizational cultures.
That's right. The book is called Making Culture Great. And what we try to do in the book is address a set of popular beliefs about organizational culture, including, does culture matter on the bottom line? The answer is yes, according to all of the research. Does culture always start from the top? No, not always, but often. Top executives have a larger impact on an organization's culture than any other single individual in an organization. And so we really go through the research with my co-author and I, Glenn Carroll, who's a professor at Stanford. We go through the research and really address these various popular beliefs. Sometimes I call them myths about organizational culture, and try to help leaders leverage culture for strategic success.
It's so important. I said to you before we came on air that I'm just after coming from a workshop over in London. And I said to the team, and the team was full of people, there were CEOs there from different countries, Ghana, Nigeria, Jordan, and Netherlands. And I said to them, most CEOs, particularly in the US, are narcissists. And they all started laughing and they kind of go, our CEO is here. But there's a reason I share that, because on the opening of this article, I'll just give our audience a few quotes here and then tell them who said them. Imagine if we could create the most just workplace in the world. We would naturally be a magnet for all the great minds out there. That's Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber. We know what happened to him. This is one of the best ones. I don't want to make an incremental change in some technology in my life. I want to create a whole new technology, and one that is aimed at helping humanity at all levels, regardless of geography or ethnicity or age or gender. Elizabeth Holmes, founder of Theranos. There's many more. Adam Newman, WeWork is in there. Steve Jobs in there. And of course, DT, Donald Trump is in there. One of the best narcissists of all time. So let's share this concept of why a lot of leaders and presidents seem to be narcissists.
Well, what we know is that the kind of base rate for narcissism in the population as a whole is about 2%. But if you look at CEO positions, that climbs to about 16%. So it's not that all CEOs are narcissists, but a disproportionate number of CEOs are narcissists. And the question is why? And so one of the reasons is that narcissists seek out positions of power with high visibility and high exposure. Another reason, which we can get into more, which I think is the more interesting and sort of manageable side of the house, is that we as observers of narcissists often confuse the behaviors that narcissists exhibit with visionary leadership.
I'm so interested in this because you sometimes get sucked in by a narcissist. I've worked for a couple, well, at least two, maybe more. And they, at the start, seem so compelling, so different. They make you feel special. They make you feel like they're going to change the world, and you want to be part of that. And then the wheels come off pretty soon when you're blamed for stuff you didn't do. You're gaslit oftentimes, and actually you kind of start to question yourself. And they know how to do this. And one of the reasons I feel your work is so important is many people who have experienced that think it's them. They think they're the problem. And that's what the narcissist wants, because they want them to bend to their will. I thought we'd share a little bit about that because it's kind of like the Force in Star Wars. You can use it for good or not so good. So you can be Yoda or you can be Darth Vader.
Well, narcissists do have an ability to draw people in because they have this kind of grandiosity and they're overconfident about their ability to accomplish things. And often they start with really appealing kinds of visions. I mean, when you think about Elon Musk and his ambitions for the human race, right? I mean, that's fantastic. So we're kind of drawn in. What we found, and my partner in this work, my co-author, Charles O'Reilly, another professor at Stanford, I'm a professor at UC Berkeley and the dean there at the Haas School of Berkeley. What we found is that the impact of narcissistic leaders is delayed. So we actually looked at the early days for narcissists, and in fact, people were all together with them. And in fact, the top team was very connected to the CEO, who was a narcissist. But over time, what we found is that a lot of things separated. And one of the most sort of distinct representations of that was we tracked CEO and top team compensation over time. And what we found with narcissists was that the CEO's compensation separated from the top team's compensation over time to get much higher. The CEOs took more credit for success, whereas for non-narcissistic CEOs, it went actually in the opposite direction. The CEO and the top team's compensation actually came together and was more similar. So CEOs think of themselves as being the one that should be attributed with the success and the one who has sort of made things happen.
There was a really funny part that you mentioned in the article where you talk about Donald Trump. So a book by 27 psychiatrists and mental health professionals analyzed Donald Trump's behaviors, concluded that his grandiosity, sense of entitlement, impulsiveness, willingness to exploit others, lack of empathy, hostility, and willingness to ignore embarrassing facts were so extreme that they could be characterized as malignant narcissism. So there's a scale to narcissism, and I think it's important for our audience to know that. But also, when you wrote this was about his first term, not the second term, which has just gone off the scale. But it was so funny in that paper that you wrote that at one point on one of the interviews, he says, "I'm probably the most humble person you've ever met." So even his humility is out of scale.
Right. He simultaneously, I can't remember the exact quote, "I'm probably the most humble person you've ever met. You have no idea," or, right, simultaneously boosting himself in some positive way, humility, and putting others down, right? So increasing the difference between, my goodness and your mediocrity. That's right. I have to say that I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I have tried to stay away from identifying someone as narcissistic or not. I am not able to make that diagnosis with any deep expertise. But there is a distinction between what the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is what the field of psychiatry and psychology use to identify what they call malignant narcissists, who are so problematic that it actually interferes with their ability to function in life. So Donald Trump is the president, and there is some functionality at some level, but there is a distinction between those two types. We're really talking about in our article the kind of garden variety of narcissism that exists on the continuum in the kind of normal population.
You mentioned a book, The Narcissist Next Door, and this guy, Geoffrey Cain, the author, he observed that a little narcissism can be a good thing in many jobs, but a lot of narcissism is a bad thing in almost all jobs. And it's an important distinction because you talk about, for example, in times of crisis, you don't want a peaceful military leader. You want somebody who has that risk profile that's going to take on huge risks. But there's also threats in there. Maybe we'll talk a bit about that because a lot of the audience from the Innovation Show work in innovation. And we see that many organizations are run by kind of more stable type leaders that are good when things are going well. But when things aren't going so well, you need a different type of leader. And in there is a little bit of nuance. And I'd love you to share your experience of that.
So actually, my co-author, Charles O'Reilly, and I debate about this. And I think he's more on the side of, I don't want to speak for him, but I think he would say, yes, there are some instances where narcissism may be functional and helpful. And he actually has done some other research that shows that's true. Maybe I'm more sort of naive about this or more of an optimist, but I believe that you can have confidence without narcissism. So you could be a leader who is good in emergency situations and who reads the room and takes control and makes good judgments without those other attributes of narcissism. And this is what I wish for in the world, because the narcissism piece always comes with an exploitation component to it. And so there's always going to be some element of others being less well off so that the narcissist can be more well off. And so I think there are plenty of leaders who I would not code as narcissists who do very well in emergency situations and you could rely on for taking charge and making good decisions.
And where I was going with that was Charles O'Reilly, of course. Tushman O'Reilly, he's known well in the Innovation Show he's been on the show many times. We covered his work on corporate exploration, but that concept of exploit, explore, I thought about how that maps to this, because the exploit kind of leader is the peaceful times leader, but actually if they're narcissistic, they can actually exploit people within inside the organization to look great, take all the rewards of the company, and actually on the long term it will suffer. But as you shared there, you want them really for the explore phase, or oftentimes they're seen in entrepreneurship that you talk about in the paper.
That's right. I mean, the grandiosity is the part that I think we all resonate with. The big ideas, the big vision, the confidence that we can make it happen, the ability to really dream big and think that they can make great things happen. That's amazing. And I think other people who are more modest and have more humility may not even let themselves dream that big because it seems unimaginable and fantastical that they could ever make something like that happen. So this is a valuable attribute in general. But again, I would ask the question, could you as an innovation expert figure out ways to unleash big, grandiose ideas in non-narcissistic people? We would be a lot better off if that would happen.
You referred to the two different streams of thoughts. I thought this was really interesting because I think now when you read this paper and you read a little bit into narcissism, you kind of start to judge people you've worked with. And you talked about one stream of thinking or research around narcissism emerges from the clinical tradition that you mentioned. But this is vulnerable or covert narcissism. And that comes from this sense of neuroticism or fragile self-concept that they're always trying to prove themselves. They have low self-esteem that reaches right back into the inner child of childhood. But then the other one is pathological or maladaptive and emphasizes defensive self-presentation stemming from low self-esteem and a more introverted nature. I'd love you to share those two differences because I'm sure lots of people listening are diagnosing
Yeah.
their partner, their children, everybody they know, because we tend to do this, but it's useful to understand these two distinctions.
Yeah. Well, the first type, the more neurotic version of narcissism, we don't see as seeking out leadership roles. So it's less likely that people in that category would have positions of power and control over us. Now, it may be the case that you're leading a person who's like that, and that's still difficult, and it's probably a higher drama situation that you have to work through. But those folks are less likely to be in leadership positions just based on their introversion and lack of self-confidence. It's really the other version that we're talking about here, the kind of extroverted, grandiosity, exploitative, and it often links with something called the dark triad, which is narcissism, sociopathy, and Machiavellianism. And you can see how those all link together, right? If you're grandiose and you're actually believing that you can accomplish ridiculously enormous things, you're almost lying to yourself, but you're much more prone to cross ethical boundaries. And I can talk more about that in research terms. But you're also someone who seeks power and exploits others. So the three often go together. And this is a recipe for who's going to go for those big jobs. And so one thing that we think about is, well, who are the decision makers for the CEO role? That's boards of directors primarily in public firms. And the board has to really think about how to distinguish between this visionary leader and a narcissistic leader. Because if you think about those in terms of Venn diagrams, they overlap. And so the trick is really to distinguish the two. And in my view, one of the most significant ways to distinguish between a visionary leader and a narcissist is to ask the question, who have you brought along with you? Who have you developed? And what you would see is that the visionary leader would bring a whole team along with them. They would probably have some folks who stayed with them for a long time. And this may be a little bit blasphemous because I know you just had the 2 episodes on Steve Jobs, but by the end of Steve Jobs' career, he had a stable team of 13 senior leaders on his team who had been with him for 13 years. There was a kind of stability and consistency there that really worked well. And I think it showed that to whatever extent Steve Jobs was a narcissist earlier in his career, he at least figured out how to behaviorally modify his behavior to bring success to Apple and growth. So this is very important to ask the question, whether you're interviewing a CEO or a potential manager, you want to know, who did you bring along with you? Where are they now? Are you still in touch? Are you someone who mentors others? Let me see the evidence. And with a narcissist, you would probably see fewer, if any, real allies for the long run, and much more variation in the relationships that they've had across time.
I'm glad you said that, because actually what you said about Jobs is actually the real story in that book, which is his kind of the hero to zero, back to hero again. And that middle period where he kind of had that belly of the whale moment and he lost everyone and actually went, I got to change my ways. That's the lovely story that's in there, and not blasphemous at all. I found a quote, by the way, by Trump, and my notes say grandiose even in his humility. Donald Trump once stated on 60 Minutes in 2017 that I'm much more humble than you would ever understand. Ukraine. I'm throwing that in there. You're more.
Yeah.
But this, one of the things that you talk about, which was, I was mapping this to the job story that I just read, and how when a grandiose narcissist gets successful, they're like unbearable because they've had a success. And then the chips, they think they become more risk tolerant. They go crazy with the risk. People trust them. And it's kind of like in your head. I know I've done this myself where I worked for one and he was a millionaire. So you're kind of going, oh, well, maybe he's right and I'm wrong. Maybe I need to buck up a little bit here. And you start to question your own reality. But this is one of the gifts that they have.
The gift of self-promotion and the denial of failure, right? And so they would even evidence that we might use to introspect and learn would not be the evidence that they would use. They would look at a situation that maybe had a mixed outcome and chalk it up as a 100% success. You know, we see many examples of that in politics and in executive life. What we also find, though, is a different risk profile for narcissists. They are much more risk-seeking because of their overconfidence. They simply believe that they're right. One of the ways that we tested this in an academic paper was that we looked at how litigious narcissistic CEOs were. And what we found was that more narcissistic leaders were much more likely to be embroiled in significantly more lawsuits. They were no more likely to win those lawsuits, right? But they were much more willing to engage in them, and often as plaintiffs, meaning that they thought they had a case to bring when in fact there was nothing there. And so that kind of righteousness can be very detrimental for organizations because CEOs can lead organizations into situations that are going to make them worse off as a result of the CEO's overconfidence.
I think we all enjoy seeing a narcissist get their comeuppance, but one of the things that I believe the universe doesn't let you away with it and keeps receipts. But when you read about it, you're like, they don't feel guilt. So actually, they're going around thinking they're the ones hard done by most of the time, to your point about bringing lawsuits against people. So they have just this totally distorted reality. And therefore, they use a lot of people like who work for them as just like they're a pen or it's some type of tool.
Yeah.
And they have no empathy for you. And I think it's important, Jennifer, to call that out because, again, I know a lot of people who have worked for narcissists and they've ended up getting like therapy and stuff like that because they feel broken. And I think this is the antidote, is understanding that these people exist in the world, just like psychopaths, just like Machiavellianism. It exists out there. And it's not you, it's them.
Yeah, there's definitely a victim orientation that narcissists have, that they believe that they've been wronged. They have, for as exploitative and insensitive as they are to others, they have incredibly thin skin themselves. And so that is not a reciprocal, that's not a symmetric relationship, if you will. And it would be natural for a non-narcissist to be really exhausted by working with a narcissist. I have a very recent paper with one of my colleagues at Berkeley, Juliana Schroeder, where we found, where it's just about to come out in a journal article form, we found that in groups, narcissists thrive in working with other narcissists, but they absolutely deflate non-narcissists. It's a very difficult situation. So if you're a leader and you're looking at your team and you notice you have a few narcissists, group them together because they'll work together fine. They have similar norms. They can go at each other and make things happen. But don't mix them in with the people who have more humility and compassion and are more at the normal level of narcissism.
So I don't have much time with you today, so I really would like to flip to the positive side, which is how do you deal with this? So in the article and in your new book, you talk about the consequence of grandiose narcissism for organizations, but also then you talk about, well, what can you do about this? And I'd love you to share those. And it goes to kind of the basics of like, well, you nip it in the bud. First, you don't hire them in the first place, or to your point, you can identify them. I'd love you to share some of those kind of ways. So for HR leaders listening to the show, or CEOs or entrepreneurs who are starting their business, because often they get duped into bringing in a narcissist and they break the company.
Yeah. Well, let me say first, I think one of our most important findings was the kind of enduring impact that narcissistic CEOs can have on an organization. In one study that we did, we found that companies run by narcissists were significantly more likely to be lower on ethics in their culture and lower on collaboration. In other words, narcissists cause organizations to de-emphasize being ethical, right? To cross those ethical boundaries. And it's not just the narcissist doing that. It's the narcissist encouraging the entire organization to do that. And second, less collaborative, meaning that narcissists like people to have allegiance to them, but not to each other, because that's a source of power if people are connected to each other and not with the narcissistic leader. So this is very problematic because if you think about ethics and collaboration, these are two sort of non-negotiables for organizational survival, right? Being ethical, like following the law, is a base requirement for organizational survival and success. And collaboration is also a key reason why you organize in the first place, is because people can do things together that they can't do alone. So narcissists can threaten the very essence of organizational survival. And that's why it's really important to identify them. Not only do they affect the culture this way, but their impact is sticky. What we found is that companies led by narcissists not only experienced those cultures while the narcissist was in the role, but even after the narcissist left, there was a kind of residual cultural impact of their presence. So we have to think both about how to nip it in the bud, right, which is being vigilant on search committees for leadership positions. You should expect that narcissists are going to apply. If it's an important position, narcissists are going to seek out that position. And then you should really try to be thoughtful about how much of the vision that the narcissist is painting is actually real. What's the evidence? Can you show me that you've actually done some of these things? Can you tell me the steps that you've taken? And of course, that very, very important question, which is, who did you bring along with you? And who did you promote as a result of it? Are some of your people running other companies now because they learned so much from you and have become so successful? So these are the kinds of discussions that search committees need to have and really be cognizant of differentiating between that visionary piece and the narcissistic piece. Then, once a few narcissists have gotten through, the question is how to deal with that. If you recognize that your leader is a narcissist, you may want to think hard about whether that's the right place for you, the right time for you to be there, and whether there are other options. But if you don't have the flexibility to move quickly, then you want to find ways to shield yourself from the exploitation. One straightforward thing that you can do is you can try to gain the narcissist's trust. If you can gain the narcissist's trust, you can kind of manage upward and do things that will cause the narcissist to be less observant of what you're doing and less micromanaging. This is true about leaders in general, right? If you can manage your leader and fulfill the things that is making your leader worried so that they can back off and not micromanage, you're better off. That is absolutely true for a narcissist. Figure out what it is they're concerned about. Make sure they know you're the go-to person to solve that issue and they don't need to worry about it anymore. I would also, as I said, if you're a manager of narcissists, I would be very cautious about how you engage them in collaborative work, because you should expect that they're going to be difficult for others to work with, and they're going to take more credit for whatever success emerges, and they're going to be more likely to blame others for any problems. And so as a leader of narcissists, you want to account for that different version of attribution that narcissists are likely to bring forward and make sure that you're giving your other people credit. So those are just a few things. I honestly, if you really see a full-blown narcissist who has these empathic and Machiavellian tendencies, I would look for an exit. It's a very difficult situation to manage. It's still only 16%. So there's a whole world out there of non-narcissistic, fantastic leaders who have vision and have an appropriate amount of confidence, who can do great things and bring you along with them.
Beautiful. I think it's just such an important article. I think it's going to be interesting to read your book as well when we get onto that book. I just wanted to share one little quote from it. So this was Neville Chamberlain who met Hitler. And after meeting Hitler, he said, this is a man who could be relied on when he had given his word. So they are immensely great at interview processes, as you shared.
Right.
But the last thing I wanted to share was so important what you said. They are very good when times are uncertain. And there's a reason I'm sharing that. We've seen the effect of that politically, geopolitically lately, when things are uncertain, and they want to create that uncertainty and make it last and make themselves look like they're the leader. And what happens then is you have more of the outcrowd become more and more of the outcrowd. And we have this huge polarization. I think that maybe as a last point, that is something we all need to be aware of.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, de Tocqueville said that particularly in times of a change and chaos, we look to a leader who shows great certainty and confidence because we want to create certainty for ourselves. One of the biggest psychological challenges that humans have is to create certainty and predictability out of chaos, right? That's job one for human beings in the world. We like when things are predictable, right? We like to know that the behaviors that we engage in are going to be accepted in the world. We like to be able to anticipate what people are likely to do so that we can either protect ourselves or get engaged. And to the extent that certainty doesn't exist, narcissists can step in and offer a bold vision with great confidence that sounds very appealing. And that certainty is almost irresistible for us to follow. So I think you raise a very timely concern that we're facing, and the polarization that we're seeing, could be in some sense attributed to the narcissists all over the world who are trying to get people to show allegiance to them rather than to find broad solutions for the world as a whole.
Beautiful message to end on as well. Jennifer, for people who want to find out more about your book, where's the best place? And maybe you'll give us a top line of why you wrote that book.
Again, we wrote that book, I think, to bust myths about organizational culture. Many leaders think that culture is fuzzy and not real, and it doesn't have impact, and it can't be managed. It's something that happens to organizations. And it turns out that there's kind of deep science behind organizational culture, how you can deliberately leverage it for strategic success. And so that's really what the book is all about, is bringing the research literature from the last 20 years to managers so that they can actually use it to develop a culture that is aligned with their strategy, that's strong, and that's adaptive over time. The book is called Making Culture Great by Jennifer Chatman and Glenn Carroll. It's at Columbia Business Press, but you can come to my website, which is just Jennifer Chatman at Berkeley, and you can find it there.
And I will share the links to that and the links to the local Amazons as well for people to find it. It was an absolute pleasure. Author of Transformational Leader or Narcissist, How Grandiose Narcissists Can Create and Destroy Organizations and Institutions, and Making Organizational Cultures Great. Jennifer Chatman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.